Welcome back to the Talking Archive. My name is Josh Jacobs. We're continuing our conversation with Randy Merkin, author of Behind the Glass, Stories from a Sports Radio Producer, which is available at behindtheglassthebook.com. Now, you were at 101 Sports until 2007 when they moved to Southern California. Now, besides great pizza and great Chicago beef sandwiches and Chicago dogs, what was the reason you decided to stay in the Windy City?
You know, I just had my twins at the time, and the last couple of years at Sporting News, I wasn't too ecstatic about the way it was going, the direction it was taken, and I just felt like, my whole family was here, and I didn't want to, with two kids that were literally just born, I did not feel it was the right time to move to California. I knew there was probably opportunities here in Chicago, so I decided to leave 101 Sports and Sporting News, and it actually was the right decision for 100%. My time at ESPN was fantastic. So, no, it was that was the main reason, though. I just didn't feel comfortable with the company at the time. I also just thought it was time to move on.
And how long before you got hired by ESPN 1000?
Let's see. I think I left right the week after the Bears lost Super Bowl to the Colts, and I was hired in July, so 4 or 5 months. I was out of work, but it was perfect because my kids were just born, so I was able to spend a lot of time with them, and it was like a good little respite for me, to get away from it for a little bit. I miss it though. I had my friend Bruce Murray, who I mentioned, he was hosting a show at Sirius, and I remember just calling him or texting him, say, "Hey, can I help you book some guests? I'm dying here. I need to do something." So I did miss it a lot. So I was happy when I was able to get back to work.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And speaking of booking guests, I hope you don't get in trouble, but who have been your favorite guests to book?
Well, it starts and stops with Barkley. Charles Barkley is the best. It's sometimes I pinch myself that I have a relationship with Charles Barkley. That I'm I wouldn't say we're good friends, but he definitely knows who I am, and I booked him. I'm going to say over the 2 times, at 101 Sports Sporting News to now, when I was at ESPN over 15 years, I probably booked him 75 times.
Wow.
And yeah, and he's and we've done 4 in-person shows with him, and he's just the best. It's always cool when he's so busy, right? He's got so much going on, but he's always giving back. And then you send him a text, and sometimes you don't get a response. Send another text, you don't get a response, and then all of a sudden, one morning you'll be driving to work, and there you see that number pop up with his name, and it says, "Yo, bro, what time?" So I would say Barkley is probably my favorite person to book. Now, the one guy that made me think maybe I can do this for a profession was when back in the day in '94 when I booked George Steinbrenner. I was nervous as heck because I did not, think he was going to do it. And yeah, when I booked him. No, and after that, I booked him a couple times early on, and then I used to start. I probably booked him 15 to 20 times, and it wasn't like I had his cell phone. I would just call him in the hotel, and he would always do it. I don't think he ever said no. If you got him, he was always friendly. He remembered me. And he was great. He always did it. So that was another guy I love booking. And first time I booked him, I woke him up because I was trying to get him at spring training with the Yankees, and I called every single day his secretary, and she gave me the same answer every day. He does not do radio interviews. And then one night I was in my efficiency apartment in 1-bedroom efficiency in Evanston, and I happened to pull up my spring training media guide, and I saw the Yankees had a home hotel, and I'm like, there's no way he stays there. I think he lives in Tampa in the off season. So I just called the hotel. So this is 10:30 Central, so it was 11:30 Eastern, just to see if he was listed. And they rang his room before I could say, "Don't ring the room." So I'm like, "Oh!" And then he answered on the first ring, and he sounded wide awake. So that's why I said, "Mr. Steinbrenner, how are you?" And he's like, "Young man, you have any idea what time it is?" And I was like, I played dumb. I'm like, "Oh my God, I forgot there's a time change." And then he's like, "You're very rude. You're very rude." And I'm like, "I apologize. Go back to sleep." He's like, "Well, what do you want?" And I said, well, I've been trying to get you all spring, Mr. Steinbrenner, but your secretary says you don't do radio interviews. He's like, that's right. And then I said, all right, well, just looking for 5 minutes. And then he kind of paused. He goes, I'll tell you what, you call at 11 tomorrow and say you're the rude young man who woke me up. I'll do the interview. And I was like, okay, done. So I called the next morning at 11, and the secretary said the same thing. He doesn't do interviews. I said, just tell him it's the rude young man who woke him up last night. And a second later, he picked up. He's like, okay, Randy, let's go. And he did it. And like at the end of the interview, he said something like, it was with Mark Jenskow and Jay Mariotti. He said something like, by the way, you've got a very persistent producer. He called me last night, woke me up, and got me to do this interview. So give him a raise or something like that. So it was really good. And then I think I got him like a year later during the lockout, and I called him up, and that was right after. I think he was suspended. I want to say, for his dealings with a gambler or something like that. And I called him up, and right away he said, no, and I'm like, no, what? And he was like, I promised the Commissioner Seelig that I would not do any radio interviews. And I said, Mr. Steinbrenner, it was right after Mickey Mantle had his press conference saying he needed a new liver. And I said, Mr. Steinbrenner, we don't want to talk about the lockout. He's like, no, I know how it works. You bring me on and something else, and you switch to the lockout. I said, we want to talk about Mickey Mantle. That's all we want to talk about. The greatest Yankee maybe of all time. And then he kind of paused, like, no, I'm not doing it. So I knew I had one more chance. So I just said, Mr. Steinbrenner. He goes, yes. I said, Mr. Steinbrenner, sir. And he goes, yes. I said, do it for the Mick. And one of the guys I worked with at ESPN, Jonathan Hood, at that time was running the board at Sporting News, and he was at 101 Sports, and he heard this whole thing, and Mr. Steinbrenner pauses for a second and goes, I'm going to do it. I'm doing it for the Mick. Do it. Put me on. And I heard him yell to someone in the background, I'm doing the interview, but it's only for the Mick. And he did like 15 minutes. It was fantastic, talking about how the Yankees are going to do everything to help save his life. And, yeah, it was great. So after that, I was like, okay, I can possibly do this, because if I was able to have the stones to call George Steinbrenner and, 2 times and push him and to get him to do an interview, then maybe I do have what it takes. So I loved it. The book was so much fun to write, because it brought back so many memories of so many great stories, that I forgot.
Oh, yeah.
So, but it's and if anyone wants the book, it's the website is behindtheglassthebook.com. Behindtheglassthebook.com. Obviously, if you want a signed copy, just let me know. I'll be happy to sign it.
That's great. And it was interesting. We were talking about Mickey Mantle right there, and Paul Simon said on the Simon and Garfunkel song Mrs. Robinson, originally he wanted to write it as Where Have You Gone, Mickey Mantle? Our nation turns its lonely eyes to you, because that was his favorite Yankee of all time.
Right.
But since Mantle was still playing baseball at the time, he thought, well, this really doesn't make much sense. So then he changed it to Joe DiMaggio.
Joe DiMaggio,
maybe he should change it to Mickey Mantle in tribute to him.
That's interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although DiMaggio just has more of a ring as far as the rhythm is concerned than Where Have You Gone, Mickey Mantle? That's kind of sounds strange.
Yeah, that's true.
But now, when a potential interview doesn't return phone calls or emails, how long between reaching out should you try again? Because, leaving messages, and is there some sort of a formula, or is it kind of depending on who
I've always felt like, obviously if someone says, hey, I can't do it, fine, no problem. But I always like if you reach out to someone, they don't respond, I might wait a couple days, send another text. I mentioned Barkley, sometimes he just is so busy, he doesn't respond right away. I've even asked him about it, and he basically said that, he just gets so many requests. I think it's sometimes after a while you just you give up. You're not giving up, but you just all right, let's give him a couple of weeks and maybe try again. Because you don't want to become like a pest, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Then they're then they remember that more than anything else. So, and it's funny, because sometimes just when you think it's oh, forget it, it's not happening, all of a sudden on my phone I'll look, and there was that person saying, hey, I apologize, sorry I didn't get back to you sooner, was real busy, but would happy to come on and talk if you're interested still. And I think a key thing to bring up is that when you're booking guests, you can't always just reach out to them when you need them, right? Mm-hmm. So you try to send them a message every once in a while when something good happens for them. Just congratulate them, or the higher name guests are the ones you want to build a relationship with. you might send them something like, we've had, back when I was working at ESPN, we had like Andy Reid on all the time, because he had a relationship with one of our hosts, and I would send him pizza afterwards. He loves pizza.
Wow.
And he would always send me a text thanking me for the pizza, or I sent him a text after they won the AFC Championship game, just congratulating him. After they won the Super Bowl, just congratulating him. Because people appreciate that, because, if all you need them for is just, hey, come on, after a while, that gets old, so,
oh, yeah.
It's all about establishing and building relationships, and, it's the best way to do it is just, not always, saying, hey, I need this from you, come on, it's, hey, congratulations, happy for you, whatever. So they just, they know that you're thinking of them.
Definitely. And, sometimes I produced several talk radio shows myself. Mm-hmm. And one of the pet peeves was when a guest wouldn't show up. And what's your advice to the host? Like, how do you handle that when the guest suddenly doesn't show up? Obviously, the old rule is be prepared with more than you need in that case. If the guest doesn't show up, what do you do sometimes? Because that was something that kind of frustrated me with one host I worked with. He'd get all panicky when the guest didn't show up, even though I'd confirmed earlier in the day, again, that they were going to be on the show. Suddenly they didn't show up.
Right. I think the best thing you can do is, what I try to do is, especially if it's a big name, I'll send a text like 30 minutes beforehand, just saying, hey, just making sure you're set to go, and usually they'll respond back like, yes, sir, or, yep, all good. But if you're right, if it happens, like no matter how many times, how prepared you are, a guest is not going to show. We usually do like pre-show meetings, and we'll say, hey, if the guest isn't there, let's stay with this topic though, right? If we're talking, if it's like say it's a Cub player, let's stay with the Cubs and just talk about the Cubs. And if the guest shows up, then you don't have to transition out of that back to the Cubs or whatever the case, whatever the guest's topic is. So I think you're right. I think it's be overly prepared. You don't want your host to panic. You don't want to panic on the other side of the glass, because then the host will panic. I think just keep it cool, right? Just say, hey, let's stick with this, what we're talking about. It's working, and then we can always transition if the guest calls in, right? To that. Like sometimes it happens. The guest just calls in late. Sometimes too. They have something else going on, and they're a guest, right? I mean, you're asking them to give up some of their time to come on. So you understand if they're not always on time. So I think that's the best advice I can give, is just always be prepared and just have something ready to go. I mean, when I first started at 101 and Sporting News early on, like I did have hosts who just were just oblivious if a guest didn't call. They would freak out, And it's different. Like a local radio, you can throw it to break early. A network clock, you have to go until it's time to break. Like you can't just be like, well, we're going to break early. No, you can't do that, because affiliates have it timed out, or sometimes they don't even have a board out there. So I mean, that's the best thing I could say, is that just always have stuff ready to go, be prepared. And I worked with some great hosts at ESPN who were always really good about that, just always having stuff ready to go just in case the guest wasn't there.
Now, that one particular host that I worked with, his final episode, a guest didn't show up, and he was cool, calm, and collective like a cucumber. So that was a good way to end the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Unfortunately, he passed away.
Oh.
It was a tragic situation. It was a former Cincinnati Reds pitcher, Frank Pastore. Loved the guy, but that was one of his weaknesses, was panicking when a guest wouldn't show up. And I was, wet behind the ears myself as a producer, so that didn't make things any better. But Frank was like a coach. He would defend you. I mean, if something went wrong and it was beyond your control, he would defend me, which was good as well. So, but sometimes it was kind of like, other times. But he said he was an 8-year baseball pitcher, had a mediocre career, and he had the record of the Big Texan in Amarillo, where he ate the 4.5 pound steak in about 9.5 minutes. And he said it was like 4.5 pounds of beef, giant baked potato, dinner roll with butter, salad, and shrimp cocktail. And he held the record for about 21 years until Joey Chestnut beat him about, 15 years ago.
Wow. That's insane. That's a lot of food, man. That's That's a little over the top.
Oh, it is. He never was able to do with anything else, just steak. He tried other foods and just could not do it. But then Frank's widow, Gina, said, actually, Chestnut should have an asterisk next to his name because one of the rules is you can't throw it up. And Chestnut threw a little bit of it up, but the judges let it pass.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But then about, I don't know, 10 years ago, a young lady from Nebraska, I forget her name, she beat him by eating the steak dinner in about 4 minutes, 57 seconds. Then about a minute later, they gave her another steak dinner, which she polished off in 9 minutes and 57 seconds.
Yikes.
I know.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. Did you ever cover events like that on your sports radio shows?
No. We watched them, and I've had Joey Chestnut on before, but that's it.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't really understand the love affair of that, but I get it. People love different stuff,
Now, the main difference between when you start and when it comes to booking guests, I was listening to an interview you did online with media oversaturation and so many outlets pulling guests in every direction. What do you do to stand out to get guests on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think it really comes, as I mentioned before, it's about relationships, and it's also just about like being creative how you book guests too, right? I mean, I'll give you a perfect example that when the Bears hired Ryan Poles, right away after he's hired, you want to get him on, but you're going to go through the Bears for that. So then you're thinking, all right, what's a great angle? And he played college. I think he was a college roommate with Matt Ryan. Mm-hmm. So then you're like, all right, if I go through that time, Matt Ryan was at the Falcons. I'm like, Falcons will never get back to me in time. You need it in a timely manner. You want it on like the next day or two, right? That's how it works in radio. It's all about the immediacy. That's the cool and the tough part about it is that, a week later it doesn't have the same feel than it does if you have them on 2 days later. So right away, one thing about it is in this industry, you build up relationships not only with athletes, with celebrities, but with fellow producers I've worked with or just guys that are in the industry. And I reached out to someone I know who we exchange numbers with all the time, and I said, hey, you got anything on Matt Ryan? And he gave me a couple numbers, and I sent a text, to both numbers, and I called both numbers, and one was a female voice, and I just, said, hey, so I sent a text, and I called him, and I'm like, oh, man, this must not be Matt Ryan. So then I'd almost kind of I was going through his foundation at the time to get him on, and I got a text back that following morning. It was Matt Ryan's wife, and she said, I spoke to Matt. He would love to come on. He's going to call you the next 30 minutes. And sure enough, I think he texted me actually 30 minutes later and said, hey, I'd love to come on today. What's a good time for you guys? And he came on, and I remember someone else in the market's like, all right, so how'd you pull that one off? Because I've been trying to get him, and I had no luck. And, now one of the hosts I work with, Tom Waddle, went to Boston College, so they have that kind of kinship, the Boston College thing. But, that's how you got to do it. You got to find different ways to go about it. But I would tell you that, a lot of it is about relationships and how you treat people as well. Mm-hmm. Whether you build relationships with agents, who, for certain players or whatever the case may be. But it's really important. It's really important. It's how you treat people, and I think that makes you stand out in a field now where there's so many people trying to get guests on.
Oh, definitely, and it's funny. The communications industry oftentimes has a lack of communication.
Yeah.
And you've got some great techniques there to break that barrier. And you're listening to the Talking Archive. My name is Josh Jacobs. We're talking with Randy Merkin, author of the book Behind the Glass, Stories from a Sports Radio Producer, which is available at BehindTheGlassTheBook.com. And next time we'll conclude our interview with Randy.